measures on the scorecard yesterday. Most of them were relatively small and pretty technical. On the business front, I am going to give you a whistle-stop tour of the 4 areas where there are big policy debates and kind of big structural issues in our tax system. So issue number 1, high street versus online retailers. You will have all heard the concerns that high street retailers are at a competitive disadvantage relative to online retailers because they face higher tax rates. A lot of that concern comes down to business rates. Business rates are a tax on business properties. This is the schedule. You can see that properties that have a higher rateable value, think prime, high street retail, have properties, think, out of town warehouse spaces, regardless of how profitable the underlying business is. On the back of that concern, the Chancellor announced yesterday a new temporary 2-year relief for retail properties. So those retail properties with a rateable value below £51,000 will see a cut in their rates bills by a third. Now, most businesses are to the left of this line, although you can see that those at the bottom are already getting 100% small business rates relief, so they're not going to not be affected by any further cut. Most of the retailers you've heard about in the press are actually to the right of that line, so the big retailers also aren't getting cuts. I suspect this morning retailers with a rateable value of £52,000 are feeling particularly miffed because now there's a £9,000 cliff edge where the bills are going to jump. So we have this 2-year temporary relief for retail properties costing almost £1 billion over the 2 years, and that'll be a help for those small retailers that are going to get a cut in their rates. But I think it's worth remembering that if similar policies are expected to continue, so if we expect to see persistent policies to help retail, then landlords are likely to get at least some of that benefit through higher rents. More importantly, I think, this leaves us with a question as what's the long-run plan for business rates? This is not the first time we have seen a temporary relief, either for small businesses or for retail. And we don't think necessarily that the problems that the high street might be facing are going to go away in 2 years' time. Now, the government announced a package of other measures, including infrastructure and planning measures that may help the high street. But if we think there are concerns that are coming from the business rate system itself, then we're better off just to fix that system. Now, that would be actually fairly easy to do. Business rates combines one of the best taxes on land values with one of the worst on business buildings. So we could fix this tax, including any problems it has to do with competitiveness between different types of businesses, by just getting rid of the latter, so moving to a land value tax. While we're thinking about kind of the online versus retailer concerns, another issue that often crops up is to do with corporation tax. So the argument is that corporation tax was designed in a pre-digital era and isn't very good at taxing our new tech giants. On the back of that concern, we got a new announcement yesterday for a new tech tax. I think to understand that, it's worth just remembering where we currently are. We have a corporation tax, it's levied on profits, and we have an internationally agreed set of tax rules that, loosely speaking, try to allocate multinationals' profits across countries according to where value was generated. So we're trying to tax profits where the value was generated in UK activities. Now, there have been long-running concerns about this system, that the concern that firms can shift their activities, thereby shift profits to lower tax jurisdictions. And there are more recent, newer concerns that these profit allocation mechanisms don't reflect user-created value. Now, users here are distinct from consumers. So think consumer, you're buying something from a shop or an online retailer. User here is trying to capture the idea that actually you could be contributing content to a social media platform, or perhaps you're part of a network and it's the fact that you're a network that makes something valuable. The argument goes that if we have a system that's trying to allocate profits to where users are based, and if for digital companies, users are a more important part of value creation, then we should adjust our system to make sure that more of the international profits get shifted towards where users are. It's that particular concern about users that underlies the particular tax we got yesterday. So the announcement was for a digital services tax. We don't know all the details yet, but what we do know is that it will be levied at 2% on revenues. And that's a really important distinction. We shouldn't be comparing 2 to 19 and thinking that 2 is much lower because it's on revenues and not profits. If you think about having revenues of £100 and costs of £90, so profits are £10, a 2% revenue tax is equivalent to a 20% profits tax. So it's kind of understandable that it's at a lower level. The key to this tax and working out how it's really going to work is going to be in thinking about what the tax base is. So we know it will apply to certain activities of certain digital businesses. More precisely what we know is it will apply to search engines, social media platforms and online marketplaces. and you haven't got to be a tax expert to work out which companies that's referring to. But I will just highlight the last one of those about online marketplaces. This is not a tax that is trying to tax Amazon when it sells to consumers in the UK. It's not about that. It's saying things like Amazon or Uber or Airbnb create online marketplaces that allow other participants, sellers and buyers, to come together. It's trying to attract that part of value. I said the devil's going to be in the detail. We haven't seen all the detail yet, but we know that the idea is to take the revenue streams from these platforms or marketplaces and work out which are linked to the participation of UK users. Now, there's no way to do that really accurately. It's going to end up being some kind of rule of thumb or a proxy, maybe looking at, for example, ad revenues and working out how many ads were seen by UK individuals. But the idea is to try and work out how much that user-created value is in the UK. Once we know more detail about that, that's really what's going to determine, the distortions of this tax, the incentives it creates, and how complex it is. Two other things to note in passing. There's going to be a cap above which it operates. So basically, a company is going to need to have global revenue from these activities above £500 million. This is really targeted at the very biggest companies. There are also a whole bunch of sort of safe harbour provisions, which mean that if you're loss-making, think Uber, or if you have low profit margins, you'll be taken out of this tax, or at least have a tax at a lower rate. It's forecast to raise £400 million, which is actually quite low when you think that the corporate tax take is more around £50 billion. But obviously that's highly certain. It could be more or less depending on how we actually design this and how much revenue gets dragged within scope. I think one of the big takeaway about this tax is that it is absolutely not, as the Chancellor claimed, updating our tax system for the digital era. It will raise some more money from tech giants, but it is completely leaving untouched the underlying allocation mechanism in corporation tax and how we're trying to allocate profits. It's just adding a new tax on top. And it's doing that because the government thinks it can do that unilaterally without having to renegotiate our international tax treaties. It has the disadvantage that the type of tax it's adding on top is a turnover tax, which disadvantages high-cost, high-revenue business models. I think the bigger question that remains is how should we be allocating multinationals' profits to different countries? There is not one right answer to that. We could change our rules and allocate profits based on users, consumers, production, or something else. Although I'll note in passing that I think it's extremely difficult to actually try to accurately value and work out where they are users. So I think it'd be hard to make that implementable. But the idea for now is that we could change how our international tax system works if we wanted to, but we need to work out what we want it to look like. Getting international agreement is clearly the preferred solution by all, but it's hard. And it's hard because we are talking about how to allocate profits to different countries. As soon as you change the allocation, you have some countries that lose, and they're not fans of changes. Finally, from the UK's perspective, since we can't do much about what the international agreement's going to look like, we should at least be clear about which problems we're trying to solve. As I said, this is not a tax that is trying to tax Amazon when it sells into the UK. It's also not a tax that is trying to deal with the underlying long-run profit-shifting issues. So if we think it's trying to fix those issues, we're going to be disappointed when we work out that it doesn't. While we're on the corporate tax base, I'll just note very quickly in passing that we had announcements yesterday for some higher capital allowances. Capital allowances affect taxable profit. They determine how much investment you can deduct from your revenues to calculate taxable profit, and they thereby affect investment incentives. The kind of recent positive history of allowances is that they've been cut in recent years, and they're often less generous than other countries. I'll put the details here, but won't go through them right now. We're going to have a temporary increase in the kind of amount you can deduct 100% first year. That's called the annual investment allowance. That'll go from £200,000 to £1 million for a couple of years. And buildings and certain forms of intangible assets, where recently there have been scraps, the rates of allowance for those have been scrapped, they're going to be partially reintroduced. That makes sense because we should be giving deductions against corporation tax for genuine business costs. I feel like this wouldn't be a genuine IFS presentation if I didn't note in passing that this still leaves us with a tax base that is not neutral, by which I mean some investments are subsidised, some are taxed, and not only are we not grappling with that issue, it's often not even recognised, although it is an issue nonetheless. But even if we can stick with this system of having capital allowances that look roughly like this, we should also remember that stability is important. This is the journey that the annual investment allowance has been on in recent years. It's been up and down. It'll go up again temporarily for 2 years. I think there's a question about why the government wants to increase it temporarily for 2 years from January. Why does it want to drag some investment forward? We also have to think about how effective it's going to be. Many companies already invest below the current annual investment allowance, so actually for many, this won't be very effective. But also, stability in tax is important. So there's a trade-off between having a temporarily high measure, but also having a rate that moves around like this. And then final one from me. You'll have heard, possibly Tom mentioned, that the so-called off-payroll workers, or IR35 rules, are one of the measures that brought in revenue. This chart is what you need to know as the background to understand that measure. What it's showing you is if you take a job, how much tax is levied on that job depends on the legal form of the person doing the job. And what I'm going to focus on for now is just that last column, the orange one, on owner-managers. If you're operating your own company and selling your services, you get access to a whole bunch of juicy lower taxes. What the government said in the early 2000s was actually there's a bunch of people in that category who we don't think should be getting lower tax rates. They implemented anti-avoidance rules called IR35 rules to try and stop those individuals getting the tax breaks. So what you can think of here is imagine that I quit IFS tomorrow. I think Paul will be a bit upset about that, but imagine I did that, and I incorporated Helen Tax Services Limited, and I'm going to sell my services back to IFS. I'd have a single shareholder, I'd be a single director, and all I'd be doing is selling my services to the IFS. Ignoring the company structure, that would still look like an employment relationship. That is the kind of business that the IR35 rules are trying to capture. And more generally, you can think about IT consultants or other kinds of contractors. Now, those rules didn't really bite very hard because people, turns out, weren't going to HMRC and telling HMRC they thought they were fall under those rules. So what we had last year was that the government have shifted the burden of determining status to public sector engagers, so to those engagers, those organisations who are buying in these services. And what yesterday did was extend that to the private sector. So now private sector engagers or companies are going to be responsible for determining the status of the individuals whose services they buy. That's really important because now the engager is going to be liable for any tax that wasn't paid. So if HMRC now finds that actually there is this disguised employment, you should have been paying taxes as if you were an employee, it's now the engager, not the individual, that's liable. And that change in who's liable is why the government thinks it's going to raise about £1 billion in the short run, because it thinks engagers will be more risk averse and want to make sure that people pay their taxes. Due to raise less in future, partly as jobs are changed in order to fall out of these anti-avoidance rules. This is an enforcement measure, but it does work to move boundaries in the tax system. So if you were concerned about parity between public and private sector engagers, yesterday sorted that problem out. But there's still a boundary between employees and individuals who can work for their own companies, and this is just moving around where that boundary is. It's also adding a new boundary, because small companies won't be liable for enforcing the new rules, and I'm sure individuals in the sector will be looking for clarity from the government about what small means. But now there'll be a distinction between which companies do and don't have to enforce these rules. Bigger picture, there is still, as I've told you all many times before, no good reason to have a boundary in the tax system. The picture I showed you before represents a system that is unfair, inefficient, and does not target entrepreneurship particularly well. So I can't really assess for you whether enough or too many people are affected by this, because I don't still really know what the government is who the government is trying to give lower taxes to. So let me sum up by saying we had a bunch of measures yesterday that I think reflect sticking plasters to bits of business tax. We have a new tax that's going to get some money out of the tech giants, but we're still not grappling with how we want to allocate profits. Small retailers will get some relief in the short run, but we're still not fixing the problems with the business rate system. We have increased generosity of capital allowances, although they've been going up and down in recent years. We're still not grappling with what the tax base should look like and the distortions it embeds. And we are changing how anti-avoidance rules operating, but I'm still waiting for somebody to tell me which group should be getting lower tax rates. I think this approach of sticking plasters isn't particularly surprising in the current climate, but it is worth remembering as we look forward to those longer run challenges in public spending that we can fix the tax system, and if we wanted to, we could do that in ways that raise some revenue too. Thank you.